Possessing the fastest highways in the U.S. and the nation's largest state capitol building, its area is larger than any European country. Texas's historical weight matches its vast size. To be precise, Texas history can be traced back to around 9,200 BC, when ancient Native Americans first inhabited this region. By the 1st century AD, the indigenous population in Texas had grown substantial. By the time colonization began in North America, the area of present-day Texas was home to about 6 major native cultural groups. This meant the fate of early European colonists largely depended on the attitudes of the local peoples. The first European explorer to map the Texas Gulf Coast was Alonso Álvarez de Pineda in 1519. But it wasn't until nearly a decade later that a Spaniard first ventured into the North American interior, thus entering Texas in 1528. An expedition led by Pánfilo de Narváez set out, but it quickly turned into an utter disaster. Hurricanes and violent storms battered the expedition, destroying 2 ships, resulting in over half the casualties from the initial 600 men. Survivors still planned to land at present-day Tampico, Mexico, but things went awry. Instead, they were blown off course toward Florida, near what is now Tampa Bay. Narváez then decided to split his forces, one part to land, the other to remain on ships, to explore the northern coast of Florida. The 2 groups planned to reunite at a harbor, but the plan failed once again. The fleet could not find a suitable port, while the 300 men marching overland were besieged by local native tribes, also enduring hunger and disease. Explorers were now dying in batches. After just a few months, only about 90 remained. But the situation did not improve. When the last of the explorers were washed ashore on Galveston Island, they were quickly captured by natives. More died from disease, starvation, and the harsh conditions of the new environment. 8 years later, the 90 were reduced to just 4. Álvar Núñez, Cabeza de Vaca, Andrés Dorantes de Carranza, along with his slave Estevanico, and Alonso del Castillo Maldonado, were the sole survivors of the Narváez expedition. The survivors later attempted to explore the American Southwest and northern Mexico on their own, but they would soon join up with a group of slave catchers they encountered in Sinaloa in 1536. Eventually, the expedition reached Mexico City, and the last few survivors returned home to Spain. However, French interest was no less than Spain's. Although the Spanish explored early, they failed to establish any permanent settlements, while the French succeeded, albeit unintentionally. It all began in the late 17th century, when a French nobleman named Robert Cavelier de La Salle decided to explore the Mississippi River to find a new passage, establishing a buffer zone between French and Spanish territories in North America. After an accidental discovery in the Gulf of Mexico, La Salle claimed the entire Mississippi River Valley for France. Returning to France, he tried to persuade the king to establish a colony at the mouth of the Mississippi to counter nearby Spaniards and convert more natives to French Christianity. After Louis XIV finally approved, La Salle was commissioned to return and begin building the colony. Due to navigational errors, La Salle ended up diverting course, establishing a settlement west of the Mexican coast. Nevertheless, the Spaniards quickly learned of the French colony and were determined to remove this thorn in their side. He was forced into the American interior, but the Karankawa natives had already done the job for them. Realizing the French colony had collapsed and the time was ripe to establish Spanish colonies, Alonso de Leon was sent to East Texas, founding the first mission in 1690. This sparked Spain's intermittent interest in Texas, though linguistic barriers and notable conflicts seemed to deter further Spanish action. Substantive action didn't begin until the early 18th century. Previously, a Franciscan missionary tried to secure French support for a new mission in Texas. Spain promptly reoccupied the area, keeping the French out, and did so quite successfully. At least they were better at resisting the French than the local natives, though conflicts with various tribes persisted. But in 1762, Spain finally persuaded France to renounce all sovereignty claims over Texas. After the 7 Years' War, the Mexican War of Independence ultimately established that most of Spain's former colonies in North America belonged to Mexico, founded in 1821. Texas became part of this new nation. The Mexican government then opened its doors wide to immigrants, hoping to counter native resistance by bringing in more settlers. But as the population grew, unrest intensified. In 1836, a new Texas government was declared, followed by a declaration of independence from Mexico. The newly formed Republic of Texas soon saw the famous Battle of the Alamo. This massacre of Texan defenders ignited the fury of many Texans, making them more determined to fight the Mexicans. Nonetheless, the Texas Revolution ultimately succeeded. These freedom fighters, rebelling against Mexican tyranny, soon voted to join the United States. Ironically, the U.S. initially didn't even want Texas. Both Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren originally rejected the proposal, but British pressure to keep Texas independent instead prompted the U.S. to decide on annexation. Finally, in 1845, both sides' Congresses approved the annexation, making Texas a state of the U.S. This naturally triggered conflicts between the U.S. and Mexico over territorial disputes, leading to the Mexican-American War. In the end, however, Mexico nominally received compensation in exchange for the U.S. gaining full sovereignty over Texas and surrounding territories. But post-war, Mexico had no other choice. Initially, Texas actually claimed these ceded territories, which include present-day Colorado, Wyoming, Kansas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico, among others. But Texas eventually relinquished these territorial claims, transferring them to the federal government through the Compromise of 1850. Just over a decade later, as the situation drastically changed, Texas chose to secede completely from the United States. Texas was thrown into panic, known historically as the Texas Troubles. Rumors spread that slaves were suddenly setting fires across the state, giving rise to vigilante mobs and intensifying the crackdown on pro-abolitionist federal ideas. This ultimately led Texas to hold a referendum on secession. The results showed a staggering 76% of Texans supporting independence. Texas formally seceded from the Union, joining the Confederate States of America, a stark contrast to its earlier plea to join the Union. Throughout the war, those who even verbally supported or sided with the Union faced severe punishment for their stance, especially in German and Mexican immigrant communities. The situation in Cook County was particularly brutal. In Cook County, over 100 Union supporters were arrested, and more than 60 of them were executed. Union supporters in Texas were massacred during the Civil War. Even after the Emancipation Proclamation Juneteenth, symbolizing a pause in hostilities, also triggered new waves of violence and anger from Confederate veterans. Nevertheless, Texas was officially readmitted to the United States on March 30th. The next phase of Texas history was a difficult Reconstruction period. Racial divisions led to Texas's once black-led Republican Party eventually losing to white Democrats. A new movement also rose within the Republican Party aimed at removing freed black people from positions of power. All this reflected the long-standing racial conflicts in former Confederate states. These challenges continued into the 20th century as Texas struggled to stabilize within the Union. Hurricanes, droughts, and the Kennedy assassination also plagued Texas, persisting for an entire century. Life remained tough for Texans.